to introduce our speakers today for us to learn more about the DFARS Rule. Our first presenter is Henry Glaspie, and we know him as Hank. Hank is the Cyber Risk Compliance Program Manager for the Office of Cyber Risk Management in the UCF Office of Research, and specializes in cybersecurity, information systems management, ERP, operations management, research, and business process reorganization. Hank is a former U.S. naval officer, and his higher education leadership experience includes the University of Central Florida, University of Hawaii, and the College of Central Florida. Joining him is Tammy Mcclellan. Tammy is a principal investigator who provides information technology consulting, systems services, and software application development at the University of Central Florida. For over 15 years, her programs with the Department of Defense have required compliance with FISMA and NIST SP 800-53. Since 2003, she has served as the program director for the Department of Information Systems Technology at UCF's Institute for Simulation and Training, where IT operation and support services are provided to all faculty and staff across the Institute. In 2017, she led efforts at IST and then joined the university's NIST committee to strengthen cybersecurity protections for federal research. Her team now supports and operates Night Shield, an on-premise enclave for campus researchers who must comply with NIST SP 800-171. She has a master's in research administration from UCF and holds several licensed software copyrights that support the academic research community. Regardless of the domain though, she is a people person and able to connect with others and support the translation of problems into IT solutions. Finally, we have Dr. Eric Dumans. He has a PhD in computational nuclear and chemical physics and has done research in modeling of chemical reactions and designed complex computational software. Since 2011, he is the full-time director of the Department of Research Computing at UFIT at the University of Florida. Starting in 2015, he and his staff have been in charge of a FISMA 800-53 moderate computing environment for research. During 2018, a second generation system was completed to meet both FISMA and CUI 800-171 requirements. The new system has the advantage that it is more cost-effective for research budgets. The system was assessed for compliance by a 3PAO. During 2019, they developed a research computing consultant program to train IT staff to better support faculty in their computing needs for research. And now I'll turn it over to our esteemed colleagues who will be telling us more about the DFARS.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm really glad that my colleagues, both here at the university and at the University of Florida, have joined me for this presentation. And we're looking forward to discussing with you some of the newer developments that have happened in the Department of Defense and in the regulations with how it deals with restricted research in defense contracts. We're going to talk to you today about the DFARS Rule 2019 D041. My colleague Tammie is going to discuss a little bit more about that specific rule and what it means. And we're going to talk also about CUI. I'm going to give a definition of what CUI is, and we're going to delve a little deeper into that so you have an understanding. And then our colleague from UF, Eric, is going to speak about how both of these rules, the CUI in itself and the new DFARS rule, how that impacts your institution. If we have time, we're going to share some war stories with you, some things we've seen during our time at our institutions, and we'll have questions for, time for questions and answers at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Tammy so she can talk a little bit about the DFARS rule.
You're on mute, Tammy.
Oh, I thought I was a speaker and I wasn't muted. I'm so sorry. I was sharing with you that I have been at the University of Central Florida now for 27 years. And as a principal investigator, I didn't know that my activities of developing applications was going to lead me down the path of cybersecurity, but that is where I have found myself. But at the heart of what I do, I like to try to break things down. So we're going to talk about the DFARS Rule 2019 D041. And we kind of labeled this about understanding what has changed. But really, I think before you know what has changed, you have to know where we were. And then you also have to know where we're going. So we're going to start off and talk a little bit about what I've referred to as the roadmap to strengthened DIB cybersecurity. So DIB stands for the Defense Industrial Base. So it represents all of us as contractors that the Department of Defense relies upon. Way back actually in 2013, the FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulation for Part 52, subsection or Section 204-21 was introduced. There had been some additional changes, ultimately leading to it being finalized in June of 2016. This is labeled Basic Safeguarding of Covered Contractor Information Systems. The reason it says basic is because there's not that much in it. There's about 15 standardized processes that cover everything from managing user accounts, access management, escorting people to secure areas, fairly high level things that we're all kind of familiar with. But what this was not set out to do was to address what we all know as sensitive information, or now the new term, controlled unclassified information. So this was not a CUI/FAR. This was just about the basics that we all need to do to maintain control and security over federal contract information, which is information not deemed to be available to the public. For all federal agencies that want to add additional protections, though, for you to handle information securely, they specifically reference NIST Special Publication 800-171 when it applies. Well, that kind of left the DoD in a position that they didn't really like because there wasn't a specific acquisition clause that said you had to do it. It was them kind of haphazardly referencing, and the NIST 800-171 may have been in different sections of the contract to indicate requirements that you needed to follow. The other aspect of that DoD didn't like is that NIST 800-171 did not have anything in it related to the reporting of cyber incidents. So they came up with their own acquisition regulation, which we've all now come to know as DFARS 252 Section 204-7012 clause. And it requires that you do follow 800-171, but in addition to that, you also must report those cyber incidents within 72 hours. Again, this came out, there were some changes to it, but ultimately it became final in December of 2017. Another thing to mention about that is it only requires that you do a self-assessment. Self-assessment meaning you as an organization review what the requirements are and you determine how closely you meet those various different requirements. So things continued to play out. DoD was kind of spot checking through audits performed by the Defense Contract Management Agency. And lo and behold, 80% of the contractors that they had performed an audit on for NIST 800-171 failed. This did not give them a very good feeling about those who were self-assessing, and they decided that there needed to be a change. And I know that you've probably heard some of these rumblings about moving towards a model called the certified cybersecurity certified maturity model, but they said we're not quite there in terms of rolling that out for everyone. So we need an interim step. And this is the rule that we're talking about today, DFARS Rule 2019 D041. It is changing the 7012 clause basically to move us in a direction that there needs to be proof of compliance. So what are they looking for right now? They are looking for us to continue to self-assess, but they want to ensure that we are following a certain methodology in terms of performing that assessment. And they have specified that it needs to be the DoD methodology. The other piece of that is they want to ensure that the score that you derive after following that assessment methodology gets submitted into the supplier performance risk system. They wanted to ensure that you did this so certainly that if you do not submit a score, you will not get an award. So no score, no award. The DFARS or the rule change also indicates that these assessments that the government was still performing before will continue, but the difference now is that the level of confidence that is going to be done is going to fall in a range of medium or high, and we'll talk some about what those types of assessments are. They also put notice out there for primes to ensure that all of your subcontractors have submitted their basic assessment into SPRS. And this is what I was mentioning. We've all kind of probably been hearing about DoD's move to the Certified Maturity Model certification known as CMMC. And the rule change basically kind of formally introduces CMMC and basically gives contractors notice that if you see CMMC in your contract, it means you must comply. Not at the end of the rollout period, but you must comply now. But it will slowly trickle out into eventually all contracts except those that are for the purchase of commercial off the shelf. One of the interesting things, of course, that changes here is that you can no longer do a self-assessment. This requires a third-party audit, or an acronym that you might see out there as 3PAO, which stands for Third Party Audit Organization. And they are out there being trained right now. The first wave has kind of gone through their training, and they will come in and actually perform an assessment of all of the controls and see where you fall. And that determines the level that you've achieved. There are basically 5 levels, and level 3 is almost equivalent to the specifications that are in NIST 800-171, but it adds 20 additional ones. You have to meet all of the requirements in order to achieve a specific level. You cannot have a plan of action and milestones document that says, oh, we'll get to it in 6 months or a year. If you don't meet it, then you don't achieve the level. And contracts will then, in RFPs, when you go to propose, will basically be specifying the level that you are required to have attained before you can receive the award. So if you don't have the right level, then you won't be getting that award. There's also indication and requirements in there about primes ensuring that your entire supply chain has been certified by the time of award. Okay, so now you know where we've been, you kind of know where we're at, you know where we're going. Let's get into some of the more specific details again about the rule change, just so you have high-level bullets again. So the purpose of the rule change was to assess the implementation of cybersecurity requirements with the DFARS 7012 clause. It went into effect November 30th. So we're kind of sitting now a couple months after that. This is already was upon us. Some of you may have already responded, but in case you didn't, this presentation is going to be very helpful to you and your organization. The rule change again affects and applies all new awards, as well as modifications for existing DoD awards, so additional funding increments, that sort of thing. It introduces the two main components of understanding the DoD assessment methodology, as well as the cybersecurity maturity model certification. With respect to the methodology, it breaks down what the three levels are. It identifies that contractors have to perform what they call a basic assessment, and we'll go over that in the next slide. And then for the CMMC framework, it's basically giving us notice as contractors that as they roll it out, if they identify that your contract meets the need to be certified, it applies immediately, and you must move forward to attain it in order for you to receive the award. Last on this slide, talking about requirements, you have to submit that basic assessment score into the supplier performance risk system. You can minimally update it, or you are required to update it every 3 years. But if there's any sort of change, you submit your score and a month later, 6 months later, your score improves, you've done better, and you want to go in and update it, you can update it at any point in time. The score does get reported by cage code and to the system security plan, basically the environment that you are describing that meets the conditions of the required controls. And again, primes are to ensure that the whole supply chain has submitted their basic score into SPRS by time of award. So let's talk about what the assessment methodology is. There is basic, medium, and high. So we'll talk first about basic. This is the requirement that falls to us as contractors. It is a self-assessment. But rather than just saying, yes, we're doing it, no, we're not doing it, we need to look at the point value that has been assigned to each of the controls in NIST 800-171. And for each of the controls that we have not fully achieved, we may have done some of it, but we haven't fully implemented all aspects of it, that counts against us. And so those points basically get subtracted. So if you look at the table over here, I just gave a simple example. This doesn't have the actual text that goes with the control. I only simplified it to give us the number. But you will go through and say, we've implemented this one, we've not implemented that one, looking at the point value that comes from the DoD assessment methodology guide. And for any of those that you have not achieved, that becomes negative points. The point total, or the negative points, are subtracted from the starting point of 110 because there are 110 controls or requirements that are outlined in NIST 800-171. So assuming that we did everything that there is to do, all 110 controls, and 3.1.2 is the only one that we didn't do, we would end up with a score of 105. That score is the score that has to be submitted into SPRS. Obviously, you may not have done all of them. And it is potential that you could end up with a negative score. Honesty is the best policy. So whatever your score is, that is the score that you need to submit to DoD, because that's all they're asking for. They're not saying you have to be at a minimum point. You just have to submit that score. As I mentioned on the other slide, the score is entered per cage code. It's important to highlight this because if you are kind of maybe organized where you have, the main university where contracts come in, and then maybe you have a research foundation that is independent and separate from the main university system, but they are also able to process contracts and awards for the Department of Defense, then a score needs to be submitted under that cage code as well. And when you enter the SPURS system, there's actually a cage hierarchy that is presented, and you need to make sure that you're applying the score to all applicable cage codes that it applies to. You're also trying to represent a score for each specific environment. If your university only has one environment, then you would only be uploading one score. But if you have an environment that is on premise, you have an environment that exists in the cloud, a specific lab has been, carved out and they're doing their own thing and IT is assessed, and, then you'd have 3 scores, right? So for every environment, you need to ensure that you have submitted a score. Even after doing that though, this is only providing the government a low level of confidence, meaning it was still based on you performing the assessment. They were not involved. So the next level of assessments is what is known as a medium assessment. And this is performed by the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center. This is kind of a new group carved out of DCMA that is specifically dedicated to reviewing for NIST 800-171. The government may perform some phone interviews, by asking for your system security plan, spot checking, your responses of how you indicate you meet certain controls. And because they feel like they've gotten a good response and answer from you, they will then sign off, and now you have a medium level of confidence. So that's not all though. They may need to go as far because of the sensitivity of the information being handled in the contract that they need a high assessment. And that again is also performed by the DIBCAC, and they will come in either on site or because of COVID, they've made now a modification to that, that they will do it virtually so that they can work with you to verify, examine, and actually see a demonstration of how you have implemented those controls. So if you say that you do password management and it requires 15 characters and a special character and an uppercase and a lowercase, they want to see it demonstrated. That's one of many of the controls, but that's just an example of what it means to actually show them that it is working. That would then give your environment under that cage code a high level of confidence to the government. So now that you have your score, your basic score, the one that we as contractors are required to determine, what do you do with it? You will first visit the SPURS website, and that URL is listed here. And I'm highlighting on the front of their page the link to open up a help guide. It has a lot of screen caps in it. I think you will find that very useful. In terms of some of the basic steps that you're going to go through though, it's important that you know that the person who is authorized to log into SPURS and submit the score must first have a SPURS Cyber Vendor User role. And that role gets established in the PIEE system. So So for those of you within your organization, you're familiar with SAM and the PI site, you're going to go there, and it may even only be certain individuals within your organization who have the ability to issue roles. So you need to determine who that is, who's going to be the right person who needs to get the vendor role, and that needs to be done first. Then that person will come back and log into SPRS. The guide, as you follow it, indicates that you need to create a header record. This is kind of, again, what they say is the highest level owner, kind of like from a cage code perspective of representing the university. And then you would select the option to add a new assessment and complete the various forms. I want to point out a couple of gotchas. One of the fields that is prompted for in the submission form for the score is it's asking about the plan of action completion date. This is referring to if you have a plan of action and milestones document. So this is that document that represents all of the controls that you've not fully completed with, right? So you can't say you're 100% fully implemented for a particular control. So what you do is you go over and you create, whether it's a spreadsheet, it's a document, you list the control, you might give a brief description, and then you indicate a date by which you're going to achieve that specific requirement. Across all of the requirements that you might have listed in your spreadsheet or your document, you're going to find the one that is the farthest date out. So if we have some that we think we'll accomplish within 30 days, within 6 months, within a year, the year date would be the one that we would list as the plan of action completion date when the submission is made into SPRS. And then, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, you would open the option for the cage hierarchy, and you'd ensure that you apply the score to all of the applicable cage codes that it belongs to. By the way, as we already said before, if your score changes, so next month you completed one of those POAM items, in 6 months you completed 2 more of them, you should go back actually and update and edit the score that was submitted to the government, because they are required now by that rule change to verify, one, that you have a score, but also to be monitoring the score that you've listed there. It has even been indicated in various blogs that they may even be monitoring the date that you enter. So if you say a year from now that you're going to have completed 100% of all of the requirements, they could contact you the next day and say, so have you updated your score? You're 100% now. The other thing to share, because of the requirement that primes need to ensure that all of those within their supply chain have in fact complied with this rule change, and you have submitted a score into SPRS, I think primes will probably all determine how they want to do that differently. And some may want to ask for proof. Some may just ask whether you've done it and take a yes or no answer. For those that want to have some form of proof, it is feasible that you could PDF the page from SPRS that reflects this entry for your cage code, indicating basic, right, and what it applies to. However, the score itself, so if you've achieved a 50, you've achieved a 75, whatever, you're 110, whatever that score actually is, the score itself is considered controlled unclassified information. So you would not want to PDF screen cap what you're looking at and send that around as your proof document to any of the primes, because you're now actually sending CUI around. Now, there are ways that CUI can be sent, but it has to be encrypted. So in order to make your life easier, the score itself is not what the requirement is. The proof that you've submitted to SPRS is what is needed. So you can use the little dots that are shown in the column headers, and you can actually select those then to hide that column. So now the actual score of 50 or 75 or whatever it might be is not visible. Okay. And that is it for me. So I'm going to turn it over to Hank, and he's going to talk all about what controlled unclassified information is.
Thanks, Tammy. So again, Tammy gave us a lot of information, but the gist and the underlying value of the information is protecting CUI. And it's the real reason why we're all here. So what is CUI, right? Well, we have something in the DFARS terminology, in which we're going to go over a little bit of the terminology, that is covered contractor information. That's the overarching umbrella for the type of data and information that we're talking about. And as you can see by the definition, a covered contractor information system is a system, unclassified, that is owned or operated by or for a contractor that possesses, stores, or transmits covered defense information. Okay, so what's covered defense information, right? Well, covered defense information can be a couple of different things, and it has some things that are underneath its umbrella also, but we're going to focus mostly on CTI, which is controlled technical information, or CUI, controlled unclassified information, or what Tammy was referring to earlier as CUI, right? So what will happen is that this CTI or CUI is marked or otherwise identified in your contract, right? And it is information that you will either be collecting, developing, transmitting, or generating and giving back to the government on behalf of performance of a contract. Exactly what we do when we perform these contracts for the Department of Defense. As you can see, there's a more in-depth definition of controlled technical information, right? And it talks about those things with military or space applications. And you might see a little bit under the definition that talks about meeting the criteria for dissemination. That goes back to the Department of Defense regulations on disseminating technical or disclosing technical information. Also, controlled unclassified information, right, is that information that requires controls that Tammy was talking about, NIST 800-171 for the basic level. And it could be specified. If you were in our colleague Ashley's presentation yesterday, which was great, and if you missed it, you know, maybe it's recorded and you can see it again, but she did a great presentation talking about Itar and export control. And as you can see, HIPAA, and these are categories of CUI. So there may be additional restrictions on top of what you might see in the contract, right? If it talks about both CUI, delineated by the 7012 clause that we talked about earlier, or some sort of export control or other regulation. CTI is also CUI, right? And there are many different types. Some examples, like you can see here, research and engineering data, manuals, technical reports. I'm not going to read them all, but these are all the types of information that we as research institutions either receive or generate or, you know, and transmit back or in execution of our contract in these DoD contracts. So what is CUI, right? So CUI is a data classification that was outlined in the federal record in 2002. It was also by executive order signed by, I believe President Bush signed that. And what it does is it delineates all those things that we used to call for official use only, FOUO, SBU, sensitive but unclassified, LES, law enforcement sensitive. It really put all of those things into one bucket of controlled unclassified information. And basically it is, you know, that a non-federal entity like our institutions receive, possess, or create on behalf of the government that requires security controls to safeguard or disseminate. Now, the governance of CUI is controlled by the National Archive and Registry Administration, or NARA, right? They're the ones that hold the governance for this type of information. And they, on their website, if you go there, you will see many categories, about 25 or so categories of what could be controlled and classified information. right? But importantly, CUI needs to be called out in the contracts that you receive. So we have a rule that here, delineated by our general counsel, as what they've determined here at UCF, is that if the 7012 clause is not in the contract, then we do not have CUI. Next slide. Now the CUI process, again, Tammy talked about the DFARS 7012 clause began appearing in all the DoD contracts, but not for commercial off the shelf. You know, it must be specified in the contract, like I said, and you know, you have to watch for the flow and designation through your subcontracts, through flow downs from your primes also. You might also see the 7000 clause, right? Disclosure of information or fundamental research. If the performance of the contract has been deemed in writing by the contract officer to be fundamental research, right, then that eliminates the CUI designation, the controlled and classified information, and that really takes a lot of the burden off of you. So a lot of the universities and other institutions, I can speak specifically for Indiana University, works really hard to get a lot of their research deemed fundamental research, so they can avoid some of these controls that have to be put into place. And again, we have to ask the questions in safeguarding controlled, unclassified controlled technical information. In the performance of the contract, are we receiving, storing, and generating it? We ask that of our primes and of our agencies to really get that in writing so that we can understand what we're dealing with. And is it properly marked? Really by the regulation, the agencies are supposed to be marking this information, this data that you're receiving as CUI. And if you can get it deemed in writing not to be CUI, then that takes a lot of the risk and the burden away from you in this process. Next slide. Now the SSP and POAM, Tammy spoke about that a little earlier, right? The scores that need to be entered in SPRS, the system security plan, you know, the technical information document that needs to be placed in the SPRS system, and the plan of action and milestones, all those things that you weren't able to accomplish to be fully compliant. What is your plan? When are you going to have those accomplished? And you will be held to that by the federal government. If you put in there that you're going to be fully compliant by June, say you put that in there today, then the federal government will hold you to that. And we'll want to understand why, you know, you haven't changed that information. So that's why, if you are not compliant. So that's why Tammy mentioned earlier that it's important that you go back in and make those changes as they are appropriate. Next slide. Now, what an SSP and a POAM is and is not. It is not a TCP or a DUA. Ashley, I believe, touched a little bit yesterday on TCPs. You will find those mostly in export control. We work really hard at this institution to make sure that there's not redundance. We work very closely with our export control office, but the TCP is not a substitute for the DFARS requirements that we talked about. The same information could reside in both. There should be synergies if you have a TCP and in your SSP and your POAM, but they are not the same. Data use agreements, those aren't the same as your TCP. Sometimes your primes will have data use agreements that they'll want you to agree to in their contracts, especially when they're giving you some of their intellectual property to perform in the contract, right? Again, not the same as the DFARS requirement, and your answer to their data use agreement is not what is the Department of Defense is looking for in the SPRS system. So we just wanted to delineate the differences between TCPs, DUAs, and the required SSP and POAM. Next slide. Tammy touched a little bit on this too. In the future, the contracts and the RFPs that you will start seeing will have a CMMC level associated with the contract. Again, that is the level that you will need to be certified at in order to even be considered for or receive the award. This is in its infantile stages. It started in this fiscal year with about 15 initial contracts, and you will see a ramp up over the next 5 years So around 2025 or so, when we will start seeing the CMMC in all awards and RFPs that deal with this type of controlled unclassified information. So it is important that you start now with your SPRS system and your SSPs and POAMs, because that will help you reach a point to where you will be ready for CMMC certification, and you will be in the right place to continue to receive contracts and awards from the federal government. And now I will pass it on to my colleague Eric from the University of Florida to discuss more the impact of all of this to your institution.
Yes. So what is going to happen is that colleges and universities are assumed to be handling CUI properly, and that will be formalized. And as Tammy already said, a survey was done recently, and the majority of the defense industrial base actually did not meet proper handling and compliance with 800-171. Interestingly, actually, the academic world was among the higher. There were more academic institutions that actually were better in compliance than the companies and the base. So it is important to take care of this. And with the new DFARS, the Department of Defense has actually instituted a scoring methodology, which is very straightforward, but it is not trivial, because 171 is a significant document. It has 110 controls that you all need to go. And the recommendation is NIST has published a handbook for compliance. It's document 160. It's not a document 800-171 that tells you, explains how you can guide it. But what I find the most useful is actually the accompanying document to 171. It's called 800-171A for assessment guide. And it basically lists, it goes through exactly the same 110 controls, but then in the form of questions, it basically says, are you doing this? Are you doing that? And most of these questions are, do you have a process, and has it been described somewhere? Many times what we find is that people do have a process. They are doing the right thing, but it's not properly documented. And then when an auditor comes, and right now these auditors are internal people, you might, if you're in the compliance office or in IT, you might ask your Office of Internal Audit. But if with the CMMC, there's going to be an external auditor come and they will ask you questions. Prove to me that you are doing all these things. The way they do it is typically they pick a number of controls. They might not necessarily do all 110. For an initial assessment, they do all 110. Every 3 years, you may have to be reassessed, and then they pick a third typically, and they will ask you, well, you are saying that whenever a password is 6 months old, you will automatically expire it. Give me a proof that you do this. How do you prove that? By showing logs, and then they will ask you for the logs. And that's why this is where the document 171A is the important one to, or useful to go through. And then you go through the Department of Defense assessment methodology document, which itself is very small. I think it's only 12 pages long. You go through it, and there are some spreadsheets that you can download from the internet that actually show you what each control and what the rating is. And then you go through it. But like Tammy was explaining, you can have a negative score, because in principle, you start from 110, which basically means every of the 110 controls counts for 1 point to get to the 110. But then the assessment methodology actually considers some of these controls much more important than others. And the ones that are more important have a rating of 5. And so if you do not meet them, you have to subtract 5. And if there are a couple of the important ones like identity management and a few of those controls, then you basically start with 110 and you subtract 5 and another 5 and another 5 and another 5, and it goes down pretty quickly. Then there are some controls that are important, but not as important as the 5s, and then you have to subtract 3. And then there are some, what I would call minor controls, you subtract just 1. And that's how you move and you determine your score. Now here again, it is important that you have a document, and that's where the system security plan comes in. The only way to realistically defend your position that you actually have a particular score like you have it is by writing a system security plan for the environment that you are treating. And that has, there's guidance from NIST on how to do that. It's very important to set the scope. You should not try, because I think that would be very cumbersome, to get a score for your entire university, meaning that for every information system in your entire campus, you are making a score. Most likely you have to delineate some system and determine the security boundary. And then you say, I'm going to focus on everything that happens inside, and I'm going to make sure that everybody who works with the system inside that security boundary is doing the right things, and I have it properly documented as described in the system security plan. And that documentation will then lead, you'll have that in hand when you go through that spreadsheet and basically do this counting of -5 for certain controls, -3 for some other controls, -1 for some controls, and you come up with your assessment. And that is in this slide at the very end. If you sort of make this all up and you don't have documentation, then you can actually be liable and be accused of making a false claim. And you certainly don't want to put your university in that position. So make sure you do the score. It is very straightforward, but you have to have the system security plan, and that requires that you take care of all the technical controls with your IT people, but also about all the business processes. And then for those things that you do not fully meet what the 800-171 says, you go and you write a plan of action and milestones. And Tammy already explained that's basically those things that you plan to have finished by some date. And the plan of action and milestones was kind of a big fuzzy thing in the beginning, because you could in principle have a plan of action and milestones for all 110 controls. Now, clearly that is not a very secure system, but in principle that was okay. In the beginning that was okay. So that has been avoided by the new formulation of this latest DFARS rule that is in effect since November. Is you have to have a control fully implemented in order for you to count it. And if it's not implemented, then you subtract the score and you put it in your POAM for now. But with CMMC, the next generation system, there is no more POAM. You basically have to do it. And when they audit you, you have to meet it. If you don't meet it, you fail. Next slide, please. So this is where the next generation comes. The self-assessment methodology is pretty straightforward. And as Tammy explained, you have to find the right people at your institution, most likely in your Office of Research, or other people who are the ones who actually sign contracts, right? Every time you have a grant from a funding agency, or you reach some funding award with some company or a contractor, they are the ones who are signing the legally binding thing. They are also the ones who typically have the authority and the accounts in PI and submit the score to SPRS. It's not IT people, and it's not some other business people in some department or some college, because this is something that the university commits itself to. but it's still all self-assessment. And then what typically will happen is with these medium and high scores, if you are a particular contractor that is doing some really sensitive stuff, most likely the government will come and contact you and say, hey, we want to really make sure that your score is good and accurate, and that you actually are doing what you're doing, because the stuff that you're working with is very, very sensitive. So it's more likely that actual companies that work on defense equipment are going to be approached by the Department of Defense than some universities, because typically universities are working on the slightly more fundamental research side if it is not fundamental research and CUI. So I think universities are going to be less approached by that. But then the next generation, CMMC, there is going to be no wiggle room. You'll have to have a third-party assessment organization come and visit you, and they will go through, ask you for your system security plan, ask you for all kinds of documentation on your logs and your controls and your business processes, and then you'll have to do it. So that's why a lot of people, and EDUCAUSE as an organization is now making the case for us as a community, the academic community, and intervene with the Department of Defense to sort of say, well, you know, we want to make sure that there still is an exception for fundamental research, and that is still being debated at this point. But that's of course very important for universities and academic research. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here I just want to. It's an interesting story. At our university, I'm responsible for implementing security in one of our systems, and I work very closely with our Office of Research, and I read about these things when they were coming and then when they were taken into effect, and I read the documentation. And so I was called upon by our vice president for research, who is responsible for actually signing. It's an associate vice president for research. She is the one who signs all the contracts. And she asked me, well, how do we do this? And so I basically guided her through the process of you know, you have to find the right person with the PI account and get the right role and then enter the number. Here is the number that I got for our system. We actually operate an enclave, and all of our Itar projects and CUI projects are going into that enclave. And I'm, as the director for research computing in IT, I'm responsible with my staff for operating that system. So I was the one who has the SSP, and I went and filled out the score and then guided them through putting it in the right place and determining the right cage number. And in the end, everything was good. And so they were happy. That was good. But while we were doing this in the week before Thanksgiving, they already told me, oh, we have several contractors who were sending us emails and they want to make sure that we entered our score. Do we have a score? And so I had the right answer for them at exactly the right time, which reduced stress before Thanksgiving, which was a good thing. And I think that ends basically our presentation, and we are now open for questions. So there is a question here that says, would these requirements apply to an OTA? What is a OTA? Authorization to, or what is OTA? Office of what?
I think they're talking about other transaction agreement. Is that correct for the person who asked that? In that case, if you're asking about will CMC apply, the answer is yes.
Yes, as soon as 7012 is entered, then it applies.
We had a question earlier. Someone was asking who enters the number in the system at University of Central Florida, and it's our Director of Compliance in the Office of Research, working with a team of people. But and you said that it was the associate vice president for research that enters it there at UF?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I guess if people are concerned about asking who does it at their institution, because we have a lot of institutions here, I'm taking from what you said to look to the Office of Research. Someone here should have the answer.
Yes.
But it's important.
And they sort of figure it out among themselves, who has the right role and who does it. But it has to be, in the end, it's the person who reports to typically the vice president for research, because they are responsible for all award contracts.
Thank you.
If you're asking if the rule change DFARS 7012 applies to all Department of Defense entities, the answer is yes. In terms of actually implementing NIST 800-171, though, you first have to go back and ask the question, is controlled unclassified information being handled, right? And that's the part that Hank was sharing with you. So right now we're in that kind of middle of the road phase, right? Where the 7012 clause is being added in pretty much every single DoD contract that is coming and being sent out. That doesn't necessarily mean that every contract is actually looking for someone to generate, receive, manage, handle controlled unclassified information. So this is kind of the negotiation phase and making sure that things have been specifically spelled out in the contract, right? So the clause may be in there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have materials that you're receiving. That's the part that you have to clear up.
Yes, so that's a very important point. So the 7012 clause is mandatory and it needs to flow through. So if you try to negotiate it out, you're most likely going to be unsuccessful because it has to be there. But you can comply with 7012 by having the determination made by the proper parties that you're not going to handle CUI. And then you don't have to do anything special, and 7012 is automatically satisfied. So that's a very important point, that you don't have to try and remove the clause, because that will most likely not work unless the person you're negotiating with doesn't really know how the 7012 clause works. If they would remove it, they're not doing their job. But you can. But in order to, when there is CUI, you can tell them and you can ask for the contractor or the subcontractor to specify, are you handling CUI? And it could be that a chain of subcontracts may have no CUI between the government and you, but there may be some CUI between you and a subcontractor. And that, that's why the 7012 clause has to be there.
It's important to make a differentiation, though, of what we're dealing with right now with the 7012 clause and where we're going with the CMMC. So with CMMC, there will be different levels. There's 5 levels. And level 1, which we didn't really kind of go over, but level 1 under CMMC kind of ties back to the FAR clause for basic safeguarding, right? There's 17 items there. The FAR clause has 15. Basically, they're calling out 2 additional items that talk more about kind of the documentation of procedures and the processes of doing things, right? But level 1 CMMC is kind of the same equivalent of, federal agencies putting that FAR clause into the contract. And people are saying, well, is that going to apply across the board? Well, minimally, yes. Every single contract, even if it's for a company that mows the lawn, right? That DoD is paying to perform some work that is anything other than the purchase of a commercial off-the-shelf product will need to comply and meet minimally CMMC level 1. And a lot of people don't understand, well, why would that apply to the company that mows the grass, you know, and performs landscaping and maintenance? Well, really what DoD started finding out is that they were providing full-on diagrams of the entire base, right? The building, where the fence line was, because they wanted to circle and highlight the part that that landscaping company was required to, you know, to support and mow around. Well, that's sensitive information. So yes, everyone will have to eventually do CMMC.
Yes, and the level 1 CMMC does not require, or there is no certification for it. You're supposed to do it, and there is no, you can't hire a third-party assessment that will certify you at level 1. The lowest level that you can get certified for is 2, and then if you are in good conscious compliant with 171, then you're almost equivalent to level 3. And the things that go beyond level 4 and level 5 are what is now renamed 800-172, and it basically makes sure that you as an organization are able and have controls in place and processes and procedures mostly to deal with advanced persistent threats. So levels 4 and 5 are really more advanced. And I think from a university point of view, we should first focus on getting level 3.
Absolutely. So I see that someone also asked, would this apply to contracts that are already in place, or would they be grandfathered in? I think you're asking, would the rule change to the 7012 clause apply? And the answer is yes, because if 7012 is in the contract, then you are already obligated as an organization, right, to comply with what is outlined there, even though you're not handling CUI in that specific contract, right? So the requirement is the submission of a score. In terms of how it affects individual contracts, though, the next time that that contract might receive some sort of modification, it could be a no-cost extension, it could be a new funding increment, right? DoD will be looking in SPURS to see if you have submitted a score, and it has to be there, even if it's negative or it's 0. Was there anything else that we missed? Thank you everyone for your feedback. Great presentation, great information. I'm glad that we've been able to share this with you today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. And this is very important information. Thank you for making it understandable for those of us that are not usually working in this area. It's very appreciated. If anyone has additional questions, our speakers have generously offered to answer questions. So you have their contact information will be provided when we send out the PDFs of the PowerPoint. Thank you again for attending today. Thank you especially to our speakers for taking time out of their busy schedules to come and give us this information. And I hope that everyone will come back again tomorrow and join us for 5 more great sessions. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for organizing it.
Oh, you're very welcome. My pleasure.
Thank you, Jennifer.
It took a village, I promise.
Yeah, yes. No, but I know it's a lot of work, but it's very, very, very worthy thing, and it's a good thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.